Snow buried every footprint before dawn. For 23 days, Sergeant Evelyn Cross never fired a single bullet. While soldiers died around her, she simply watched through her frozen scope. Rumors spread that she was terrified. Officers called her useless. Even her own squad whispered the word coward. Then, on the 24th morning, she squeezed the trigger exactly once. Her bullet flew nearly 5,000 meters through a blizzard no sniper believed was survivable, and struck the most feared enemy commander in the entire war. Only afterward did everyone discover why she had refused to shoot before that impossible moment. The winter had teeth that year, the kind that cracks stone and split old timber in the night. The outpost sat wedged between two ridgelines somewhere in a mountain corridor that no map fully agreed on. A forgotten pocket of the front line where supply trucks arrived late and radios crackled with more static than orders. Snow fell in sheets thick enough to swallow a manhole, and the wind screamed through the passes with a voice that sounded almost human. Inside the bunker, breath fogged in the lantern light, and soldiers pressed close to a stove that could barely hold back the cold. It was in this place, among men who had learned to distrust silence, that Evelyn Cross earned her reputation, though not the one she deserved. She was 34 years old, and before the war swallowed the valley, she had been one of the finest marksmen anyone in her unit had ever trained beside. Instructors spoke of her in hushed, almost reverent tones, the way people speak of something they cannot quite explain. She had grown up on a wide stretch of farmland where her father taught her to shoot before she was tall enough to see over the fence posts, and by the time she was old enough to enlist, she could read a crosswind off the bend of a wheat stalk from 300 meters away. She was calm in a way that unsettled others, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and moved through the world with the unbothered patience of someone who had already made peace with waiting. None of that mattered once the fighting started, because what the camp remembered was not her skill. What they remembered was the silence of her rifle. Before the siege, she had already carried a quiet legend of her own, though few in this particular outpost knew it. In an earlier campaign, in a different mountain range entirely, she had held a position for 6 days without eating a full meal, waiting for a single armored convoy to pass through a narrow gap, and when it finally did, her shot had disabled the lead vehicle and stalled an entire offensive. Commanders who had served with her before called her the most disciplined marksman they had ever known, but none of those men were here now, and reputation built in one place rarely traveled fast enough to protect a soldier in another. To the men freezing beside her on this ridge, she was simply the woman who would not shoot, and that single fact erased everything she had ever proven before it. For 3 straight weeks, while other snipers fired again and again, sometimes 4 times in a single day, sometimes 8, occasionally as many as a dozen, Evelyn lay motionless in her position and did nothing. She watched, she measured, she waited, and she never once pulled the trigger. A captain, his patience worn thin by frostbite and grief, finally cornered her outside the mess tent and told her, in a voice loud enough for half the camp to hear, that if she was too afraid to die, then she should hand in her insignia and go home. A younger soldier, someone she had once shared rations with, laughed under his breath and called her a coward to another man's face, certain she was out of earshot. She was not. Word spread through the outpost the way frost spreads across a window, quiet, complete, and impossible to scrape away. What none of them understood was the shape of the man they were fighting. His name was General Victor Draven, though few who survived an encounter with him ever spoke it aloud. The soldiers under siege had given him another name instead, one that traveled faster than any official report: the Winter Butcher. He was a ghost with a rifle and a mind built for patience of his own, a commander who had never once been struck by enemy fire in more than a decade of combat. He shifted position constantly, never lingered in the open longer than a few minutes, and used decoys and false movements to draw enemy snipers into revealing themselves before he vanished again into the white. 7 fortified positions had fallen under his direction. Thousands of soldiers had died trying to stop him. Every marksman sent against him had failed, some paying with their lives, and headquarters had grown desperate enough to offer a bounty so large it was whispered about even among officers who claimed not to care about money. Survivors of the fallen outposts described him not as a reckless killer but as something closer to a patient predator. Someone who studied the habits of his enemies for days before ever committing to an attack, striking only when the odds were entirely in his favor. That patience was, in its own dark way, the very quality that made him nearly impossible to kill. and it was a quality that Evelyn alone in the entire camp seemed to recognize and respect enough to match. Every sniper on the ridge wanted that shot. Ambition burned through the camp like a fever, men volunteering for exposed positions, begging for extended watch hours, desperate for the one shot that would end the siege and make their name. Evelyn alone showed no such hunger. She remained still, wrapped in white cloth against the snow, saying almost nothing, and the quieter she became, the louder the accusations against her grew. Stories about Dravens circulated through the camp like a second kind of weather, one that never let up. Veterans swore he had once let an entire scouting party walk within 100 meters of his position and simply allowed them to pass, unwilling to waste a shot on men who were not worth the exposure. Others claimed he kept a private ledger of every sniper who had ever tried to kill him, crossing out their names one by one as they failed and died in the attempt. Whether or not the stories were true hardly mattered anymore, because fear had already done the work that facts were supposed to do. Soldiers who had faced artillery barrages without flinching found themselves glancing nervously toward the tree line whenever his name was mentioned, as though saying it aloud might summon him from the fog. Command had grown so desperate that they began pulling marksmen from other sectors entirely, flying them in on transports that could barely land in the storm, each one certain that they would be the one to finally end it. Evelyn watched them arrive, watched most of them leave again in silence after a week or two of fruitless waiting, their confidence worn down by the same impossible math that she had already accepted from the very beginning. She never explained her theory to any of them. She only kept measuring, kept recording, kept building the picture that no one else seemed patient enough to build. Life inside the outpost had a rhythm all its own, shaped less by orders from headquarters than by the relentless demands of the cold. Soldiers rotated through watch shifts in pairs, huddled behind sandbags and drifted snow, counting the hours until they could return to whatever meager warmth the bunker offered. Rations arrived infrequently, and when they did, they were often frozen solid, requiring careful thawing over the stove before anyone could manage to eat. Laughter was rare but not absent. Small moments of dark humor passed between exhausted men trying to hold on to some fragment of normal life in a place that seemed designed to strip it away. Evelyn rarely joined these moments, not out of coldness, but because her attention always seemed to be elsewhere, fixed on some distant calculation the rest of the camp could not see. It did not take long for people to notice that Evelyn behaved differently from every other sniper on the line. While others obsessed over sightlines and kill counts, she filled notebook after notebook with numbers that seemed to have nothing to do with combat. She measured wind direction at different hours of the day, tracking how it shifted as the sun moved. She recorded humidity levels with a small handheld gauge she had built herself from spare parts. She noted barometric pressure changes with the same discipline a physician might use to monitor a dying patient. She studied the density of snowfall, running her gloved fingers through fresh powder to judge its weight and texture, then wrote down what she found in careful, cramped handwriting. She tracked the angle of the sun as it crossed the narrow strip of visible sky between the ridgelines, timing exactly when and where the light broke through the clouds. She listened for the rhythm of helicopter rotors in the distance, logging when they appeared and how long they lingered. She counted the vibrations of tank treads through the frozen ground, distinguishing between different engine types by ear alone. She even noted the particular cadence of enemy footsteps on packed snow, a skill that seemed almost supernatural to the men who watched her work. Some nights, she stayed awake past the point of exhaustion simply to record how the temperature dropped in the hours before sunrise, convinced that even a difference of 1 or 2 degrees might someday matter more than anyone around her could imagine. Her notebook itself became something of a curiosity in the camp, a battered thing with a cracked leather cover that she kept wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the snow. Soldiers who passed her position sometimes caught a glimpse of the pages, dense with columns of numbers and small sketch diagrams of wind patterns curling around the rock formations, and most of them simply shook their heads and moved on, assuming it was some private ritual meant to calm her nerves rather than a genuine military calculation. Nobody imagined that the scattered numbers might one day align into a single, unrepeatable window of opportunity. A young lieutenant, more curious than suspicious, finally worked up the nerve to ask her directly what exactly she thought she was doing out there in the cold. Hour after hour, day after day, she answered him with a single word, delivered without emotion. Waiting. He walked away more confused than before, and nobody in the camp claimed to understand her. Not truly. Not yet. The fury against her reached a breaking point on the day an entire patrol walked into an ambush less than 2 kilometers from the outpost. 15 men were lost in a matter of minutes, cut down by mortar fire and rifles positioned with brutal precision, the kind of precision that carried Draven's signature. Grief and rage tore through the camp like wildfire. Soldiers who had once respected Evelyn's silence now saw it as something closer to betrayal. They believed, with total conviction, that if she had simply fired at any point during those 3 weeks, some of those 15 men might still be alive. The bodies were brought back on sleds, pulled through waist-deep snow, wrapped in whatever canvas the camp could spare, and the outpost held a grim, wordless vigil that night around the stove. One of the fallen had been barely 20 years old, a boy who had shown Evelyn a photograph of his mother's garden only days before, proud of the tomatoes she grew every summer back home. His death seemed to strike the camp harder than the others, a small, specific grief that gave the larger tragedy a face. Men who had never spoken a harsh word to Evelyn before found themselves glaring at her across the fire, their jaws tight, their hands curled into fists. They did not bother to hide. She sat apart from them, as she always did, and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would undo what had already happened, and no explanation she could offer that they were ready to hear. The captain who had once mocked her outside the mess tent now demanded action rather than insults. He ordered her, in front of witnesses, to fire on any enemy officer who came within range, regardless of distance or conditions, regardless of whether the shot had any real chance of success. Evelyn refused. She did not raise her voice, did not argue, did not offer a single explanation for her decision. She simply said no, and the word landed like a slap across the entire outpost. She was written up for insubordination that same afternoon. Her command privileges were stripped within the hour. Soldiers she had once trusted began turning away when she entered a room, and some stopped speaking to her altogether, as though her silence had become contagious and they feared catching it. The days that followed were the loneliest of the entire siege. Meals that had once been shared in loose, tired camaraderie now happened around her rather than with her. Conversations pausing whenever she sat down and resuming only once she left. Someone scrawled the word coward on a supply crate near her bunk, and though it was scrubbed away within the hour by an officer who found it distasteful, everyone in the camp had already seen it, and the damage lingered long after the paint was gone. Letters home from other soldiers, later recovered and read by historians, described her in unflattering terms, a strange, cold woman who seemed to have lost whatever courage had once made her a soldier at all. None of them knew that she read every one of those unspoken judgments in the eyes around her and absorbed them without protest, because protest would have meant explaining a theory that still had 10 days left to prove itself, and she was not willing to risk exposing her calculations before they were ready. She kept to her position through it all, rising before dawn each morning to check her instruments, cataloging every shift in the weather with the same unshaken patience she had shown from the very first day. If the isolation wounded her, she never allowed it to show. Thomas would later say that the only sign of what she carried during that stretch was the way her hands sometimes lingered a moment too long over her notebook before she began writing, as though gathering the strength to keep going despite a camp that had already decided who she was. It was the young soldier who had once called her a coward behind her back, a private named Thomas Whitfield, who finally broke through the wall everyone else had built around her. Guilt gnawed at him after the 15 deaths, and one bitter evening he found her alone at her position, staring out into the white nothing beyond the ridge. He asked her, quietly this time, without mockery, why she refused to fire. What followed was the first real explanation anyone had received, and it changed everything Thomas thought he understood about the war and the woman fighting it beside him. Evelyn explained that General Draven never exposed himself within any range considered survivable by conventional sniper doctrine. He kept himself positioned somewhere between 4,700 and 4,900 meters from any known firing point, a distance so extreme that no confirmed kill had ever been recorded there under real combat conditions. At that range, she told him, the physics of a bullet's flight became almost unrecognizable. Wind could push a round meters off course before it ever reached its target. Temperature changes altered air density in ways that warped trajectory unpredictably. The rotation of the Earth itself, the Coriolis effect that most people never had reason to think about, bent a bullet's path just enough to matter at extreme distance. Even the natural curve of the Earth's surface had to be calculated into the shot. A miscalculation as small as a few centimeters at the muzzle could mean missing the target by meters at the far end of that impossible flight. She told Thomas that she was not waiting out of fear. She was waiting because she would only get one chance, one single bullet fired under the one exact set of conditions that could carry it true across nearly 5,000 meters of hostile air. Fire too early, Under the wrong wind, the wrong pressure, the wrong light, and the shot would fail. The position would be exposed, and Draven would simply vanish deeper into the mountains, untouchable for the rest of the war. There would be no second attempt. She drew a rough diagram in the snow with a gloved finger, showing him how the bullet's path would not be a straight line at all but a long, curving arc, rising and falling and drifting sideways under forces most people never had reason to consider. She explained that at shorter distances, a skilled marksman could simply compensate for wind and gravity with practiced instinct, adjusting almost unconsciously in the moment before firing. But past a certain distance, instinct stopped being enough, and the margin for error narrowed to almost nothing. A gust arriving half a second early could push the round wide by the width of a man's shoulders. A miscalculation in the humidity could slow the bullet just enough to drop it short. She told him that every failed sniper who had tried for Draven before her had likely died making exactly that mistake. Trusting instinct where only precise calculation could succeed, Thomas listened in silence, and for the first time since the siege began, someone in the outpost understood. Headquarters had grown tired of waiting. A formal message arrived by radio, blunt and final in its wording. Evelyn was to fire at the next viable target within days, or she was to be relieved of duty and sent home in disgrace. The pressure from above matched the pressure from within the camp, a vice closing from both directions at once. Still, when soldiers pressed her for a timeline, she gave them the same answer she always had: not yet. Almost everyone had made up their mind about her by then. They believed she was simply afraid to pull the trigger, afraid of the consequences of missing, afraid of dying in the attempt, and no amount of cold logic about wind and pressure could shake that belief loose from men who had already buried friends because of her silence. Thomas Whitfield became the exception. Quietly, without announcing it to anyone, he began helping her. He learned to read wind speed using strips of cloth tied along exposed rock. He helped drive measurement stakes into the frozen ground at set intervals, allowing her to track subtle shifts in the terrain's temperature. He recorded barometric readings when her hands grew too numb to hold the gauge steady. Together, in the brutal grip of the storm, the two of them built a picture of the mountain that no one else in the outpost could see, a living map of wind and pressure and light that shifted by the hour and sometimes by the minute. Their partnership did not go unnoticed. Other soldiers whispered that Thomas had lost his nerve as well, that whatever fear or foolishness had infected Evelyn was now spreading to him too. He ignored the mockery, though it cost him friendships he had built since his first week in the unit. In the evenings, after their measurements were logged, he sometimes asked her about her life before the war, and she answered in small fragments, telling him about the farmland where she grew up, about a brother who had also enlisted and was stationed somewhere far to the south, about the particular quiet of a wheat field just before harvest. She never spoke about fear, and after a while, Thomas stopped expecting her to, because he had begun to understand that fear was simply not the language she thought in. Night after night, they worked in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin within minutes, their breath crystallizing in front of their faces, their fingers aching inside layers of gloves that never seemed to be enough. Thomas asked her once, during a lull in the wind, how she could possibly track so many variables at once and still trust the result. She told him that a single mistake, however small, would not just cost her the shot. It would likely cost her life, and possibly the lives of everyone counting on her to end the siege. She explained that most snipers thought of a shot as a single calculation made in the final seconds before firing, but she had come to see it differently, as the last link in a long chain that had to be forged perfectly from the very first day. He never doubted her again after that, and slowly, without either of them saying so directly, he became the only person in the camp she trusted completely. By the 24th day, the storm that had gripped the mountains for weeks began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The wind that had howled without pause finally began to change direction, and the barometric pressure Evelyn had tracked so obsessively started to drop in a pattern she recognized from her notebooks. The temperature rose by a fraction, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to alter the density of the air just slightly, just enough to matter. She woke Thomas before the sky had even begun to lighten, pressing a finger to her instruments and telling him to feel the difference himself, though to his numbed hands the morning felt no different from any other. She trusted her equipment more than her own senses by then, and the equipment was telling her something the rest of the camp could not yet perceive. She spent the early morning hours checking every measurement twice, running calculations in her head that she had rehearsed 1,000 times in the weeks before, cross-referencing wind readings against sun angle, pressure against humidity, each number sliding into place like a key finally finding its lock. For the first time in over 3 weeks, every single variable she had tracked pointed in the same direction at once, a convergence she had begun to fear might never actually arrive. When she finally looked up from her notes, her expression calm but her eyes sharper than Thomas had ever seen them, she said only one word to him: today. Intelligence confirmed what Evelyn's instincts had already told her. General Draven was expected to inspect a forward position along the enemy line that morning, a rare and dangerous appearance for a man who normally avoided exposure of any kind. Reconnaissance suggested he had grown more confident in recent days, perhaps believing that 3 weeks of silence from the ridge meant the threat against him had passed entirely, that whoever had been sent to kill him had either given up or been reassigned elsewhere. That confidence, born from the very silence that had cost Evelyn so much within her own camp, was about to become the single mistake that ended his life. The distance from Evelyn's position to that inspection point measured almost exactly 4,886 meters, a number she had calculated and recalculated so many times it had become carved into her memory, repeated under her breath the way another person might repeat a prayer. The window during which he would be visible and stationary long enough for a shot was estimated at only 11 seconds, the brief pause expected while he exchanged words with a subordinate officer before stepping into his vehicle. 11 seconds, compressed from 24 days of preparation, would decide everything. If she missed that window, there would be no second opportunity. Draven would disappear back into the mountains, and the siege would continue indefinitely, with more lives lost for every day it dragged on. Command relayed the intelligence to her with a final, almost pleading message, asking whether she was certain she could make the shot. She sent back only 2 words in reply: "I am." The camp fell into a strange, taut silence as the morning unfolded. Word had spread that something was happening, though few understood exactly what. Soldiers who had mocked Evelyn for weeks now found themselves standing near her position, unable to look away, unable to speak above a whisper. The captain who had once threatened her career stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, though he made no move to interfere. Even the men who had turned their backs on her after the ambush found themselves drifting closer, drawn by something they could not name, some instinct that told them history was about to be written on this ridge whether they understood it or not. Thomas knelt beside her, watching the wind flags one final time, calling out subtle shifts in speed and direction that only he had learned to notice. He had spent so many nights beside her in the cold that he could almost predict what she would ask before she asked it. And now, in the final minutes, their communication had narrowed down to short, clipped phrases, numbers exchanged like a private language only the two of them could speak. Evelyn made her final adjustments to the scope with hands that did not shake, despite the cold, despite the weight of everything resting on the next few seconds. She checked her notebook one last time, running her thumb across pages worn soft from 24 days of handling, then set it aside and did not look at it again. Nobody spoke as the moment approached. The wind seemed to hold its breath along with the rest of the camp, a brief and eerie stillness settling over the ridge. Somewhere behind her, she heard the captain shift his weight in the snow, and further back, someone's breath caught audibly in their throat, quickly stifled. Evelyn lowered herself completely into position, cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle, eye fixed on the scope, every muscle in her body disciplined into perfect stillness. Through the lens, the world had narrowed to a single distant point, a smear of gray uniform against white rock that would only remain visible for a matter of seconds. She exhaled slowly, the way she had trained herself to do 1,000 times before, timing her breath to the small window of calm in the wind. Her finger found the trigger with no hesitation, no tremor, only the calm certainty of 24 days of preparation compressed into a single motion. Then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report cracked across the ridge, swallowed almost instantly by the wind, and the bullet vanished into the white distance, disappearing into snow and fog and the vast empty space between the ridge and the valley below. For nearly 10 agonizing seconds, nothing was visible, nothing was certain, and the entire camp seemed to stop breathing at once. Thomas counted silently under his breath, the way they had rehearsed, watching the stopwatch clenched in his numb fingers. The round traveled through shifting gusts of wind, through pockets of warmer and colder air, curving invisibly along a path that existed only in Evelyn's calculations, a path no human eye could follow and no instrument could track in real time. Far below, General Draven had just stepped toward a waiting vehicle, pausing to speak with an officer at his side. utterly unaware of the death already crossing the sky toward him. The bullet struck him directly, ending the life of the most feared commander in the war in a single instant that no one on the enemy's side could explain. For a moment, nobody on the ridge moved at all, as though the shot itself had frozen the mountain in place. Then, through the distant haze, faint shapes could be seen scattering in confusion around the fallen commander. Officers dropping to the ground, others running for cover that made no sense against a threat they could not locate. Chaos erupted through their command structure within minutes. Officers scrambling for information that did not exist, unable to determine where the shot had come from, or how anyone could have hit a target from such an impossible distance. For them, it was as if death itself had simply reached down from the storm. Confirmation came later that day through reconnaissance channels, verifying beyond doubt that General Draven was gone, and that the recorded distance of the shot stood at 4,886 meters, a figure that would be studied and questioned for years afterward by anyone who heard the story. Ballistics officers flown in from headquarters spent hours combing over Evelyn's position, measuring angles, checking her equipment, cross-referencing her notebook against the weather data recorded by their own instruments, unable to quite believe what their own numbers were telling them. One of them reportedly remarked that the shot should not have been possible under any accepted standard of the craft, and yet the evidence sat directly in front of him, undeniable and precise down to the centimeter. The outpost fell into a silence unlike any it had known during the entire siege, a stillness heavy with disbelief and something close to reverence. Soldiers who had spent weeks avoiding her eyes now found themselves unable to look away, watching her from a distance as though seeing her for the first time, as though the woman standing quietly beside her rifle bore no resemblance to the coward they had spent 3 weeks condemning. The captain who had once told Evelyn to hand in her insignia stood frozen near the command tent, unable to find words for what he had just witnessed. When he finally approached her, he did not offer the formal apology she might have expected, but instead simply removed his glove and extended his bare hand toward her in the freezing air, a small, wordless gesture that carried more weight than anything he could have said aloud. Evelyn shook it once, briefly, and said nothing about the weeks of insults that had come before. It was Thomas, the young soldier who had once called her a coward within earshot of half the camp, who broke down entirely, tears freezing against his cheeks as he apologized for every doubt he had ever carried about her. He told her he should have trusted her from the very first day, that he was ashamed of the words he had used before he understood what she was actually doing out there in the cold. Evelyn only offered him a small, tired smile, the first real expression anyone had seen on her face in weeks. She told him that if she had fired even 1 day earlier, out of fear or pressure or impatience, the shot would have failed, the position would have been exposed, and the war in that valley might have been lost entirely. She reminded him, gently, that he had been the only one willing to help her carry that burden, and that his trust had mattered more than he would ever know. News of Draven's death spread through the wider front within days, carried by radio operators who could hardly believe the numbers attached to the report. Enemy communications intercepted in the following weeks revealed a command structure thrown into disarray, unable to agree on a successor, unable to explain how a single shot fired blind through a blizzard had found a man who had evaded death for more than a decade. Some of their own officers reportedly refused to believe it at first, insisting it must have been an accident, a stray round, anything other than what it actually was. For the soldiers on Evelyn's Ridge, though, disbelief was not an option. They had watched her do it with their own eyes. In the days that followed her victory, Evelyn Cross refused nearly everything offered to her. She turned down the metal headquarters wanted to pin to her uniform in front of assembled officers, telling the colonel who offered it that she had not done it for a piece of metal. She declined every request for an interview, every reporter who made the difficult journey up the mountain, hoping to hear her account in her own words, and turned away even the friendliest of them with the same quiet, unshakable politeness she had shown the captain who once threatened her career. Thomas asked her, on her last night at the outpost, whether she planned to write any of it down, to make sure the truth of those 24 days was recorded somewhere beyond her own notebook. She told him that the mountain already knew what had happened, and that was enough for her. When the storm finally cleared enough for safe travel, she simply gathered her gear, said little to anyone, and walked out into the snow alone, her figure growing smaller and smaller against the white until she disappeared entirely from view. It was a young officer, sorting through abandoned equipment left behind at her position, who finally discovered the full truth of what those 23 silent days had actually contained. He found her notebook tucked beneath a folded blanket, its pages swollen with cold and use, hundreds of entries filling every available line. He sat down in the empty bunker and began to read, and what he found inside was not the record of a frightened woman avoiding combat. It was wind speed logged by the hour, barometric pressure tracked across every shift in the storm, temperature readings taken so frequently they blurred together into an unbroken chain, sun angles calculated for each hour of daylight, and detailed notes on enemy movement patterns stretching back to the very first day of the siege. Near the back of the notebook, he found a page that stopped him entirely, a single entry written the night before the shot, its handwriting steadier than he expected given the cold. In it, she had listed every possible reason the shot might fail, one after another, methodically, as though daring herself to find a flaw she had missed. Wind shift beyond tolerance, pressure drop insufficient, visibility collapse. Beside each line, she had written a single word in response: prepared. It was not the record of someone hoping for luck. It was the record of someone who had already accounted for every way the world might refuse to cooperate, and had made peace with each possibility in advance. He understood then what no one else in the camp had been willing to see while it was happening. Evelyn had never been afraid to fire her weapon. She had spent 24 days building the only possible path toward a shot capable of ending not just one life, but an entire campaign of slaughter that had already claimed thousands before she ever arrived. Every measurement, every silent hour spent watching through a frozen scope, every accusation she absorbed without defending herself, had been part of a discipline so complete that almost no one around her could recognize it for what it truly was. He thought of the captain who had mocked her, of the soldiers who had turned their backs on her after the ambush, and felt a quiet shame settle over him, though he had done nothing himself but arrived too late to understand. The young officer closed the notebook that day and carried it with him for the rest of the war, unwilling to let it be lost or forgotten among the discarded equipment of 100 other soldiers who had passed through that outpost. He would later tell anyone who asked that he had learned more about discipline from those swollen, water-stained pages than from any training he had received before the war began. He never managed to track down Evelyn Cross again, though he asked after her whenever fate placed him near soldiers who might have served alongside her in later campaigns. Most had only fragments to offer. Rumors of a quiet woman who never stayed anywhere long enough to be remembered by name, who moved from posting to posting with the same unhurried patience, that had once been mistaken for cowardice on a frozen ridge no map fully agreed on. History tends to remember only the final bullet, the single dramatic instant that ends a story and gives it a shape people can repeat around a fire or in a quiet room years later. What history rarely remembers are the thousands of patient decisions that came before that instant, the countless moments of restraint that made the final shot possible at all, the accusations absorbed in silence, the friendships lost, the nights spent measuring wind and temperatures that could kill a careless man in minutes. Somewhere in the mountains, long after the war had moved on to other valleys and other names, the last traces of Evelyn Cross's footprints slowly disappeared beneath fresh snowfall, erased the way all footprints eventually are. What remained behind her was not a legend built on violence or speed, but one built on something far rarer, a living testament to patience, discipline, and the kind of precision that only comes from a mind willing to wait exactly as long as the truth requires.